Ferguson, curator of medieval Britain and Europe here at the British Museum. We have an international audience for tonight's art history extravaganza. And so even though I'm saying hello to you here from my office at the museum, you out there are joining us from all over the world. Thank you for being here with us tonight for what is sure to be a thrilling hour examining the role of images and objects in the promotion of the cult of Thomas Becket. This event is one in a series organized by the museum in connection with our current major exhibition, Thomas Becket, Murder and the Making of a Saint. The exhibition explores Becket's remarkable life, death, and legacy over a 500-year period and includes an extraordinary range of objects from manuscripts to jewel-like reliquary caskets, sculptures, and even an entire stained glass window from Canterbury Cathedral. If you haven't made it to the exhibition yet, it will be on until the 22nd of August. For those of you who sadly can't make it to London, we have a beautiful illustrated catalogue of the show on sale that that tells the story in detail, the story of the exhibition. On our YouTube channel, you can find recordings of our previous events, including a curator's introduction, a tour of the exhibition, and discussions of Becket's miracle windows and pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. Tonight, however, we are joined by two art history superstars, Professor Paul Binsky and Professor Alixe Bovey, for a discussion entitled Becket, Charismatic Cathedral and Sacred Storytelling. Paul Binsky is Emeritus Professor in the History of Art at the University of Cambridge, a Fellow of Gonville and Caius College, and a Fellow of the British Academy. He was awarded his PhD from Cambridge back in 1984 and taught at Yale and Manchester before returning to Cambridge in 1995. Paul has been extraordinarily productive over the course of his career, and many of you will be familiar with his groundbreaking publications. These are wide-ranging from thematic studies on medieval death to a monograph on Westminster Abbey and the Plantagenets. And more recently, Paul published a book focused on Gothic sculpture. But it was back in 2004 that Paul published what is perhaps one of his most famous and best-loved books, Becket's Crown, Art and Imagination in Gothic England, 1170 to 1300. It is a book that repays rereading and close engagement with the text and images that Paul himself has thought about for so long. and I'm sure we will be doing some of that tonight. It's hard to put into words just how significant Becket's crown was and is, setting the scholarly bar extremely high. Becket's crown has long been out of print, but recently its publisher, the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Arts, have put up it online for free. So do take a look if you haven't already. Professor Alixe Bovey, our second speaker for this evening, is Dean and Deputy Director of the Courtauld Institute of Art, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Alixe is a proud Canadian, but left to pursue her master's and doctoral research at the Courtauld Institute under the supervision of Professor John Loudon. Alixe has worked as a curator of manuscripts at the British Library and a lecturer at the University of Kent before returning to the Courtauld in 2015. For those of you who follow Alixe on Instagram, you will know that she is concerned with the interface between art history and art practice, and she has spent a large part of her career encouraging scholars to engage with making as a form of thinking. In 2013, she launched the revolutionary doctoral training program Material Witness, which had students chiseling, carving, and making stained glass, as well as a whole host of other hands-on activities. I myself remember doing some of these. Alixe likes to say that during her time at Kent, Canterbury Cathedral was the greatest classroom in the world. Tonight, we benefit from her years of experience there, looking closely and thinking hard about the building and the cult of Thomas Becket. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Paul and Alixe.
Thanks very much, Lloyd, and hello, everybody. When T.S. Eliot composed his play Murder in the Cathedral, first performed in 1935, he was well aware of the resonances between the story of St. Thomas Becket and ancient drama. For there is something of Greek tragedy about this supremely dark tale of the rise, alteration, and spectacular fall of a man who, though in many ways not great, is nevertheless brought down in the most dramatic circumstances by his erstwhile friend, King Henry II, and by his own flaws. While it's easy to speak of Becket as a saint, it's far harder to speak of Becket the man, possessing a personality or a psychology. No medieval word existed which meant personality. A persona, as we know from Greek drama, was a mask held before an actor. In medieval thought, the persona was outer, not inner. What lay within may well have been not personality, but God. Becket wore many masks: the mask of the aspiring courtier, of the high politician, of the austere churchman, but he had God within. Robert of Cricklade, writing of Thomas as a young man, says he was, I quote, a slim man of pale countenance and dark hair, with a long nose and regular features. He was gentle of manner, sharp of intellect, and he was easygoing and amiable in conversation. He was authoritative of speech, if somewhat stammering. He was so keen in discernment and comprehension that he would always solve difficult questions wisely, end quote. Well, key to this description are externals and conventions. Becket's look, with its beaky nose, could be that of a Roman senator. His manner is gentle, his intellect is sharp. Easygoing and amiable are virtues of aristocrats, courtiers. Yet, Thomas presented his biographers with an issue. Saints were canonized by their virtue in life and by their miracles. In this period, virtue was overtaking miracle working in importance. Thomas was one of the last miracle workers. So how could a man who was in so many ways not saintly in the course of his life truly become a saint? And the answer lay in his death and miracles as much as in his life. And it lay in the tremendous support mechanism of art and architecture which framed and promoted his cult. In this he was not alone. For the 12th and 13th centuries were a great age of saintly personas. Men of the church needed strong characters to fend off kings, and emperors. We think of the fearsome Bernard of Clairvaux, who preached the Crusades and who fired up the austere Cistercian order, a truly great speaker and a theologian. We think of St. Dominic, the intellectual. And above all, from the European perspective, we think of St. Francis of Assisi. Like Becket, Francis was a rich kid who ended up in a hair shirt, who renounced his former life and wealth. Like Thomas, he was a contrarian. Becket was not primarily an intellectual, and nor did he start a religious movement like Dominic and Francis. But like Francis, he was a wonder worker, a performer of miracles, and he was also a saint of the people. Thomas became an icon for the people at large, not because he was easy to imitate, but because he was a freedom fighter, a champion. One could only stand back and wonder at his miracles. But as in politics, so in life, the miracles were a way of setting things straight, bringing health. Can I have the next slide, please? Great. In his defense of the church and lofty manner, he became a type, like the stamp of a character, the seal of approval, as on this beautiful seal of his successor at Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who masterminded Magna Carta. He provided a model of fortitude for the saint bishops to come. Thomas was canonized in 1173, Wulfstan of Worcester in 1203, Hugh of Lincoln in 1220, Lawrence O'Toole, an Archbishop of Dublin in 1225, William of York in 1227, Edmund of Abingdon in 1247, and Richard Witch at Chichester in 1262. Within a century, that movement was exhausted. What had mattered was Becket's character as a saint, not his personality. And that was given shape and force by all the cathedrals which sprang up around these great men, but particularly by the model of the new Gothic shrine church, Canterbury Cathedral itself. Canterbury Cathedral has always been, for me, a wondrous space, even the charismatic one. By that, I mean that the cathedral seems to have Becket's presence in life and death. Everywhere, the cathedral is Thomas. Even parts of it, such as the corona at the very east end, the circular space for the relic of the tonsure of his skull, reminding us of Becket's crown of martyrdom. The cathedral speaks to us just as much as does Thomas. And what it says is something like this: behold, this is the scene of a great tragedy, wondrously overcome and acknowledged through the whole world. And that indeed is the entire message of Christianity. We know well the terrible story of Thomas's martyrdom in December 1170. Scarcely a year after Becket's canonization in 1173, the choir of the church was gutted by fire, and a new Gothic church begun in French fashion, built by a man from France, William. Canterbury was a version of the very latest in Gothic design, inaugurated at Saint-Denis, outside Paris, a generation earlier. Big windows, spreading vaults, and magnificent columns create a spacious walkway round the lofty shrine in which Thomas was finally placed in 1220. Yet the charisma of Canterbury lies in a far older resonance than the then modern Paris. Thomas's biographers used the oldest Christian language of martyrs, gladiators, and athletes of Christ in illuminating the lives of their spiritual hero. In effect, St. Thomas's martyrdom, voluntarily undertaken, connected Canterbury to the great early tradition of Christian martyrdom in the primitive church, which gave Christianity the universal idea of what a martyr was. Becket was in this league. This mattered. Canterbury had been the entry point for Roman Christianity in the 6th century. Its primatial authority, its authority over the whole Christian realm of England, had apostolic authority. It was the home of many saints, and it was fiercely protective of its past. Brilliantly and deliberately, Canterbury's architecture tells the same story. We can see it as a French building, and we can see it also as an early Christian martyrdom, alluding to the Christian Roman past. Aside from knowing who the first Gothic architect was, we know less than we would like about how the new building, really an adaptation of the shell of the old choir, was conceived. Its planning probably entailed conversation not only about Paris, but also about Rome. Rome was home to the largest bureaucracy in the known world. Many English churchmen knew it and its monuments. They may well have known the centrally planned and double-columned 4th century mausoleum here of Santa Costanza, a building with doubled Corinthian columns and curved walkways, very like the Trinity Chapel, where Becket was to be enshrined. The use of columns is eloquent, for these played a major role in the ancient basilicas and in the new Gothic churches. And this was begun by the Roman Emperor Constantine. As early as the 4th century in Rome, as at Old St. Peter's and St. Paul's, vast churches built around the relics of the very special dead, the new cult of martyr apostles, and then post-apostolic martyrs, prompted the Emperor Constantine's architects to rethink classical columns as actual embodiments of the prophets and saints who carried and sustained the fabric of the church. Gothic churches, though vaulted in stone, are full of columna and other features, which contemporary commentators likened to the prophets and saints as columns of the church, pillars of the Christian community. The walls nearby, as in St. Peter's, were covered with vast images of the saints and their deeds. It was natural to see these remarkable people in the building. These living stones provided a dazzling and widespread legacy. In Rome, such columns are sometimes made of red granite. Canterbury uses white and pink-white marbles from what is now modern Belgium for the columns around the shrine and its pavements, very probably alluding to the symbolism of the white brains and blood, the lily and the rose of the Song of Songs, referred to by Thomas's biographers. This idea of a martyrium as a place not only housing a martyr, but being the actual place of martyrdom was unusual. And Canterbury turned it to advantage by chaining together the idea of red and white stones, blood and brains. Becket became part of the building, not literally, but figuratively. The stones don't just symbolize Becket, but in a special sense are Becket. Canterbury is at once about great and terrible deeds and also presences. And, as in the great basilicas, Becket's life and miracles are relayed to us in story form in the windows nearby. And much in the story of Becket's martyrdom echoes the Passion of Christ, whom the martyrs imitated. Thomas even had 4 main biographies echoing the 4 Gospels. Christ's tomb in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was described as being of red stones and had openings in it like the images of Thomas's tomb as shown in the glass. We might ourselves not wish to imitate Thomas, but the art framing him is full of imitation and reference, and so depth. Subliminally then, his cathedral sent out a message of apostolic authority and reassurance to the community at large. For Thomas, like Francis, was a saint of the people. In this, he was deeply political. This question of the people at large is important for anybody thinking about the public, as all exhibition organisers have to. The few surviving illustrated Becket leaves of around 1230, here's one of them, illustrate a versification of the Quadrilogus, the 4-book history of the saint. They stress Becket's role as a popular leader. A handful of illuminated books like this survive from this era, retelling the lives of famous saints such as Edward the Confessor. In one of the most dramatic and telling pictures in the whole corpus of English medieval illustrated hagiography, Becket here parts company with Henry II and Louis VII in France. There's a sense of terrible finality captured by the space and contrary movements of the parties. The kings meanly point back and threaten. Like their henchmen, the tension is building across the void. Thomas, more calmly, indicates upwards to the word beatus, blessed, over his head. Be careful, he seems to say. And he moves towards the ordinary people, called, with that little red caption there, the vulgus, the vulgar people who petition him. Thomas is a better king, an alternative king, by virtue of not being a temporal king. You may know the sentiment vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Becket was one of the earliest famous men to whom this idea was attached in the life of the Anonymous of Lambeth, composed around 1172-3. The populace were meant in a Christian sense as God's elect. Becket's biographers rapidly linked his cause to the notion of the ancient liberties of the English people. He was a freedom fighter in stark contrast to the Angevin despotism of the famously angry and willful Henry II. In Thomas's name, England was given more holidays than any other saint. He was the major saint of the Londoners and had a chapel in his name on London Bridge. His life had begun in Cheapside in the city. He was a unifier, a one-nation saint. In an age in which the great saints were regional, Cuthbert in the north, Edmund in East Anglia, Swithin in Winchester, Becket was everywhere. Were it not for St. George, who flourished in the more militaristic political culture of the 14th century, Thomas might have become our national saint. And indeed, his cult spread with phenomenal speed to France, to Scandinavia, to Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, the Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, Italy, as here at Spoleto, and Hungary. Thomas was universal because his cause was universal. We live in an age of pandemic. So too did they in the mid-14th century, when, after the Black Death, in the middle years of the century, donations to cathedral shrines shot up, as this graph shows, after the year 1348-49. This was partly because fewer people held more disposable income, partly because people just wanted to give thanks that they had survived. The greatest medieval expression of the idea of one nation, of the bringing together and healing of the community, was pilgrimage. For in a sense, while Becket did not found a great tradition of thought or devotional practice, he did assist in nation building. Around him, the people, as the voice of God, gathered. What better expression could there be of this than Chaucer's Canterbury Tales of the 1380s, built when Canterbury Cathedral's sleek and elegant new nave was being constructed, and following the great upsweep in shrine donations. For the tales bring us together, just like the pilgrims, for instruction and delight. Perhaps exhibitions do the same. In Thomas's name, Chaucer's wonderful satire of the different classes of people, then called the estates of society, was shaped and delivered. Chaucer's figures are first and foremost characters, personae, like the pardoner here, passing off pig's bones as sacred relics, the classic fraud. Here he is in one of the earliest collected Chaucer manuscripts in Cambridge. There's a tradition, a dramatic tradition. Japanese no plays and English medieval morality plays are examples, which possess a kind of stock set of characters immediately recognizable to the audience. The Canterbury Tales celebrate the amusement of character, and perhaps even by now of personality. Becket's life and biographers belonged, I think, to an earlier, more heroic age, which reached back to the very foundations of Christianity in England and beyond. And that point is made no less firmly, if more subtly, by his art, at which point I'm honoured to hand over to Alixe.
Classic. I, of course, was muted at first. Well, thank you, Paul, for a wonderful talk, and also to Lloyd and colleagues at the British Museum for this wonderful invitation to talk about Becket in the context of a show that is really exciting on a number of levels, not least because it was the first exhibition that I was able to visit as things started to loosen up here in London. And it is, you no doubt have gathered, is an exhibition that tells the story of this saint through objects and images. And many of these objects and images themselves tell the story of Becket. So it's the story of many stories. And what I want to do this evening is talk about some of the star objects that are in this show as a way of thinking about how storytelling images contribute to the cult of Becket and the charisma that Paul has spoken so eloquently about. And I think if I have an ulterior motive, it's first to encourage everyone who can see this wonderful exhibition to do so. And there's actually an awful lot of material as well for those of you who aren't able to visit London and see it online, and this talk in itself will be part of that. But then also, I think, to encourage people to go and visit Canterbury, which will still be standing long after the show has come down. So now I'm going to try to advance my slides to the next slide, and if I can't do it, then maybe someone someone on the other end can do it for me. Have I got a next slide now? Oh, brilliant. Thanks. Okay, so this is this image shows one of the objects that's in the exhibition, and it's very well known, I think, to those of you who have studied the cult of Becket. It's been a cover image on a lot of books about Becket, and I think one of the great things about being able to see something like this displayed in an exhibition is that you can actually see where the image fits into this very fat volume tucked at the end of a collection of letters put together by Alan of Tewkesbury, probably in the mid-1180s, of Becket's letters. So most of the fatness that you can see on the left side of this book are Thomas Becket's own letters. And on the right, we have the much shorter account of John of Salisbury, who was one of the witnesses of Becket's murder. And one of the really fascinating things about Becket's murder is that it had 5 witnesses who all wrote accounts of what they saw, John of Salisbury being one of them. And this image, made not long after the martyrdom, tells the story in a kind of executive summary form. And can I have the next slide, please? Sorry, my little device here has stopped working. At the top, in the upper register of the image, we're just going to take a deep dive into it. It shows the knights arriving angry and armed. Their armor here looks very silvered, I think because the pigments have oxidized, but it gives a good effect of their kind of, their male suits that they've come in. And you can tell that everyone's angry and all talking at once because their hands are all pointing, a medieval gesture of speech. So it's a kind of cacophonous scene, interrupting Thomas at his table and summoning him. And he already with halo and with his bishop's mitre, and with Edward Grimm sitting next to him, the man who's kind of staring out at us rather apprehensively, seemed interrupted mid-slicing of his supper. And if we go to the next image on, you'll see the lower scene, which recounts the story Thomas, having come out to meet the knights, marches through the cloister and into a chapel almost immediately thereafter, known as the Martyrdom, challenges, has an altercation with the knights, who then slice the top off his head, cutting him down, flick his brains onto the floor, and in the process snap the tip off the sword. And if we go, you can also see, we'll look at a detail of this image in a second, but on the right side, you can see pilgrims kneeling before the shrine with candles all around it, those bright red tapers. And it's also, I think, an important point that this image makes, that Thomas is cut down right by the altar, when you can see that there's a cross and a veiled chalice nearby. And if my next image kind of highlights some of the features of this, that relates, I think, quite closely to the story, the kind of historical narrative. There's naming and shaming in this image, that one of Thomas's knightly murderers was a man called Reginald Fitzurse, the Urse being the Ursus, bear, Latin for bear, which is shown on his shield. So pictorially, he's singled out here. And then the next image will show the crown of Becket's head, a really kind of gruesome thing. When you go to the exhibition, you've got to kind of really look closely at this, and you'll see that the bloodied chunk of the top of Becket's head falling to the ground right by the broken sword that so forcefully was Becket accosted. And these are relics in the making that are falling through the air in this image. By the time this image was made, both were enshrined at Canterbury and in objects that enabled people to go and venerate them. The altar right by the site of Becket's murder was known as the altar of the broken sword point, and this broken sword was one of the relics. And in the Corona Chapel at the very east end of the cathedral, and the inspiration for the title of the book that Paul wrote, Becket's Crown, the top of his head was also enshrined. And as pilgrims made their way around the building, they were able to see these sites. And if we go to the next image, you'll be able to see that another one of the first things I've been able to do since lockdown was go back to Canterbury Cathedral and up into the tower. And this is an iPhone snap down at the site where this took place, the chapel known as the Martyrdom. And so many interesting things happen in Canterbury immediately after Becket's murder. So much about Canterbury is that it's the place where these events took place. And yet, because of the cult that formed so successfully, the physical fabric of the church also changes very rapidly. So this becomes a chapel of the Martyrdom. And I've actually pasted a tiny little memorial from John of Salisbury's account onto the floor. When pilgrims went to visit Canterbury Cathedral, which they began to do according to John of Salisbury and other writers, almost immediately after the murder, the first miracles are reported within just a few hours of Thomas's death. They began to chart a course, were guided by the Benedictine community there on a course through the building that narrated the story of the martyrdom itself. So this chapel was one of the kind of key sites that people would visit. I've got a little map, actually. I'm sure that some of you know Canterbury very, very well, and others maybe not. So if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to see a plan of Canterbury as it was at the time of the murder in 1170. And within just a few years, the building was changed very dramatically. But a plan like this lets you see how the narrative of the martyrdom winds up being inscribed on the building. So the chapel, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but one of the chapels that we were looking down at from the tower is the martyrdom. If we go to the next slide, and the next one, I think. Sorry. Sorry, I think I've got my slides in a slightly funny order, not being able to advance them myself. I'm handicapped, but the building, as I say, changed very dramatically in the years after Becket's murder, not least because there was a fire that gutted the east end of the building in 1174. And this precipitated a rebuilding of the east end and the movement of Thomas's body from the crypt where it was initially placed into a new shrine in the upper church that Paul has already mentioned. And Paul also showed this wonderful image that is in the exhibition as well, made about 50 years after Thomas's murder, which records many of the same things that we saw in the John of Salisbury image. And maybe we can zoom in a little bit on this image and look at the next slide. So this image records the things that took place in this spot at the altar of the sword point. And the site of the murder is marked on the floor, at least notionally the site, with a much later marble slab. And you can see I've put a pink ring around the chapel where this event took place on the building. And if we go to the next slide, you'll be able to, we'll zoom in a little bit on the image, and you'll be able to see some of the features that are now very familiar. Becket's crown, this time in the form of a much less gory cap than the one that we saw in the John of Salisbury image, falling to the ground, the sword, the soldiers pointing, the bear on the shield of Reginald Fitzurse. And also one of the witnesses whose account of the murder of Thomas is not among the many sources that we have of this event. He describes how his wrist was sliced. Edward Grimm, whom we met in the John of Salisbury image, his wrist is being sliced as he tries to protect Thomas. So if we move to the next image, we can start to plot these moments through the building, and these become a narrative that pilgrims visiting Canterbury could kind of re-experience. They could go to the martyrdom, to the altar of the sword point. They could go down to the crypt and visit the shrine that Thomas was placed in. And the form of this shrine is really very interesting indeed. If we move on to the next slide, we'll go into the crypt ourselves. The crypt as it appears now is rather different, at least the east end of the crypt, than it did in 1170. Thomas would have recognized some of the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral, but not necessarily this element of it. What I've done is I've shown you the plan of the cathedral crypt as it is now, but I've also marked out in red the limits of the building as they were in 1170. Thomas's body was taken down into the crypt and placed inside a coffin, and the coffin was placed inside a special kind of shrine, like a porthole shrine, also known as a foramina shrine, which has holes in it that would let the devout reach through and touch the entombed saint. And I've pasted, in possibly a childish way, a cutout of the Porthole Shrine in between the two very shiny Purbeck limestone pillars that stand to mark this spot. Even after Thomas's body was translated into the upper church in 1220, pilgrims would still come to the crypt and see this shrine, because it had been the site of so many miracles. In fact, the miracles that are recounted in so many of the written sources and also in the glass that I'll be turning to in just a second, relate to the miracles that took place in the first 4 or so years of the cult. My next slide, let's just move on, sorry. So my next slide shows one of these porthole shrines in action. And they're important, I think, for interpreting the stained glass that I'm going to finish up with in a couple of minutes. There are porthole shrines to a number of saints. Very few of them survive. We know that there was one at Westminster Abbey for Edward the Confessor, and we have a wonderful image from a narrative account that is formally rather similar to the Becket leaves that that Paul mentioned and that I'll talk about again. And when there's a very good surviving example of one of these shrines at Salisbury Cathedral to St. Osmond, and when my now 26-year-old 6'5" stepson and I were visiting there, I made him stick his head inside it, which is what you can see there as a kind of demonstration. And I show this slide whenever I can, mainly because of the happy memory of him saying, "Can I take my head out of the shrine now, Alixe?" which is one of my happier moments as a step parent. And so this becomes a kind of icon of the cult. We move on to the next image. Here's an image of Canterbury Cathedral, as you could only see it from Google Earth or a helicopter, which shows in red the footprint of the building up until 1174, and then the kind of gentle expansion of it as of about 1220 after the fire and after the rebuilding of the East End, showing the location of the shrine and the new and improved Coroner Chapel all the way at the East End. So the building changes but a great deal as a result of this fire, although its footprint doesn't expand that much. And it is a magnet for people all across Europe. And Paul has, I think, shared with us a number of really wonderful examples of images that really remind us that Thomas was a European saint, that his news of his martyrdom traveled immediately across Europe. It really scandalized people and intrigued them, reminding them of the early Christian martyrs, and encouraged them to make images in Spain, in Italy. And my next image actually shows what I think is really one of the star images of the whole exhibition, which is a magnificent font from Sweden, which I'd only known, in fact, from really bad images. So going to see the exhibition was an absolute joy for me, to see what a really fine and intriguing piece of carving this is. And I think it's a reminder for us just how important this cult became and how quickly. This is made within a decade or two of Becket's martyrdom, and it tells the story of the martyrdom in a slightly different way, in fact, than some of the other images that I've showed you. If we go to the next image, you'll see that there's some naming and shaming on this font, but it's actually not so much the heraldry of the knights that identifies them, but the blame that's apportioned to Henry II, who holds a scroll saying Rex Henricus, reminding us and reminding the Swedish people who gathered around this baptismal font that it was the king who instigated the chain of events that resulted in the murder of this bishop. And if we move to the next image, I think I've got a rather wonderful detail showing the knights attacking Becket, the tip of the sword going into the top of his head, no squirming away or evading the extreme brutality of this event as the archbishop falls to the ground. The next image too shows us that attention to detail and understanding of the ins and outs of the story, with Edward Grimm standing by his wrist here about to be sliced by the sword, and then also the proximity of the altar to this event. So this object tells the story without the benefit of the narrative of John of Salisbury or any other written account. It tells it in a way that's very familiar to us, having had the crib of the text of Salisbury and others. And fascinating it is too that it moved around Europe in this way. I want to end or conclude really by, well, actually, no, I'm not going to conclude quite yet. We're going to nip to short. Can we have the next image, please? So here too, I mean, I tried to find some images that I didn't think Paul would show, and I think I might have got one here with this wonderful window at Sharp. So I'm going to end with some of the Canterbury glass, but here we have from one of the chapels at the great Gothic cathedral near-ish Paris that shows the Becket about to be cut down, but also with Edward Grimm's hand here picked out in this very kind of gory flash red glass. So the story, if you like, the kind of key kind of brand elements of this story get beamed across Europe really remarkably quickly and consistently. And it also gets woven into other kinds of accounts. And let's look at the next slide, which shows an object that is displayed in the exhibition. And in fact, my snap of how it's shown in the exhibition is here. This is the Chronica Maiora of the monk of St. Albans, Matthew Paris, not to be confused with the Times columnist. Easy mistake to make, but similar functions, both chronicle their times. But this Matthew Paris ingested the work of an earlier chronicler of St. Albans, Roger of Wendover, but he added to this, to Roger's account, his own image, which you can see next to it, of the murder of Thomas Becket, the wrist slice of Edward Grimm. So it gets woven into historical narratives, and then also into the kind of more popular accounts that that Paul touched on earlier in noting the Becket leaves. And I've got an image from the Becket leaves as my next slide, which tells the story. I mean, it's such a shame that we don't have the whole of this manuscript. Four of the surviving leaves are on display in the exhibition, and they're an absolute delight to see. It must once have been part of a whole life of Becket, concluding with his murder and miracles. But it tells the story of Becket's murder, or rather of elements of his life leading up to the murder. And what we have to kind of think about, I think, is what medieval people visiting Canterbury as pilgrims would already know about Becket. I mean, if we go to the next slide, this is where we'll sort of pivot back to Canterbury and think about what pilgrims would have experienced there. They would have gone to the Martyrdom, they would have gone down to the crypt to see his first burial place, then they would have come up through the church, climbed marble steps towards the shrine. And then if they were there in the summer when it was really popular, they probably would have had to queue up. And while they were queuing, they would have been able to look at the glass. And the glass is, fragmentary. We lost a lot of it in some at the time of the English Reformation, but even more of it at the time of the English Civil War. But what survives is one of the most remarkable collections of medieval English stained glass you'll ever see. And I'm going to focus on one of the stories and just as a kind of parting shot to think about what people thought Becket could do. Why did they come to Canterbury, and what did they hope would happen? And this story, I think, is a really excellent one for thinking that through. It's very easy to see from the ground. It's at the bottom of a great window, and it tells the story of the family of a knight called Jordan Fitz-Isolf. If we go to the next slide, it's got 9 scenes, and I'll tell you the story more or less as it appears in the narrative of the shrine keeper, Benedict of Peterborough, whom I've already mentioned, who tells the story of a plague that devastated a family and began by killing a nurse called Britonis. And here's her funeral. You can see her yellow draped bier as the pallbearers take her to her burial place. The next scene shows the second favorite son of the family, who has fallen ill with the same thing, and his parents are lamenting him. A priest is administering the last rites. But the next scene shows a group of pilgrims arriving from the site of from Canterbury with flasks full of the miraculous water that they could acquire. Becket's blood with made from a kind of almost homeopathic solution of the remnants of Becket's body, they added water and drew it off into these flasks. And the account describes how the dead boy's lips are prized apart with a little butter knife, and the holy water dribbled into his mouth. And the next scene shows how there's the same scene. Oh, sorry. The next scene shows how he starts to recover. His parents promise that they're going to give this rather substantial dish of money to the shrine of the saint. And in the next scene, we see the boy sit up and the parents giving thanks. But the textual narrative tells us that actually the parents don't do what they said that they were going to do. They don't make the donation to the shrine that they'd promised. And in the following scene, Becket appears to a leper who's identified with the rather surprising name Gimp, and says to Gimp that you need to tell the Fitz-Isolfs that they need to make good on their promise, or else something terrible will happen. The following scene shows Gimp sitting up in bed, telling the Fitz-Isolfs, who, as you could probably see from their body language, don't really listen to him, that they'd better make their cash donation to the shrine of Becket immediately. But they don't. And then the central scene shows what happens, which is that the saint leans out of the sky and kills their favorite son, strikes him dead, and the rest of the family have a kind of recurrence of this plague. And the closing scene takes us to this now familiar Porthole Shrine, where the mother with a staff and the surviving son watch as the father upends a donation to the shrine. So I think a fascinating story that reminds us that the images were asking people to do something. They were asking people to venerate the saint, and they were also encouraging them to go to Canterbury and make an offering at the shrine. And in some kind of quite interesting way, I think the exhibition at the British Museum and Canterbury Cathedral itself still make these kind of requests of us to attend to the cult of this still interesting and still important saint. I'm going to hand it back to Lloyd at that point.
Well, thank you so much, Alex and Paul. I can hear the applause kind of ringing out from Buenos Aires to Philadelphia. You both did so much to in your discussion to reveal the kind of place these images and objects had that were associated with the cult of Thomas Becket. There's a lot there to get us thinking about the place that he held in the visual world of late medieval Europe. And to those of you out there who have questions, please do put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and they'll find their way to me. But just to kind of kick us off and get a little bit of a discussion going, I wondered if I might ask a kind of soft question that is, what brought both of you to the study of Thomas Becket? How did you become interested in the cult? And as a kind of follow-on, where do you think the study of Becket has to go, and why do you think it's important to keep thinking about him? Paul, maybe I could ask you that first.
Well, thanks, Lloyd. Yeah, I was taken to the Middle Ages. I was going to say the role of Canterbury actually is very important in this, because I had two epiphanies as a 9-year-old boy. One was watching Laurence Olivier playing Henry V in that fabulous Agincourt setup. Do you remember? It's such a marvelous moment. Boy, as a 9-year-old warlike little boy, that really converted me. The other was going to Canterbury. My parents taking me to Canterbury to see the armour of the Black Prince. I wasn't interested in Thomas Becket at all. And what then happened was my mother, who knew a thing or two, said, this is a very interesting building because the architect fell off the scaffolding and was killed. She then took me to the tomb of Archbishop Chichely, which has a cadaver lying at the bottom of it. And then she said, well, here, the Archbishop of Canterbury was slaughtered. And of course, being a small boy of 9 years old, I got all these events completely mixed up and had no idea of what connected to what. So Canterbury, nevertheless, the building made a huge impression on me at the time. And subsequently, I just became aware of this particular sense that something awful happened there, and yet somehow it redeems us. And I think that as I became an art historian really mattered to me. Alixe, I don't know about you.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's also the building, that has been my kind of great teacher, and its magnetic properties. It's an immensely complex and fascinating. Must have been there hundreds of times, and I've never been without noticing something I hadn't seen or learning something. And I think, in focusing on Becket, it's easy to overlook the fact that it was a site of importance for many other reasons. I mean, Becket's cult was really framed by other key relics that Canterbury had of Alfege and of St Dunstan. And for the monks at Canterbury, I think all these cults were in play, and the many, many altars that they had. And I think understanding the way that the cult intersects with the operations of the Benedictine monastery, with Canterbury as the kind of epicenter of Christianity in England, has asserted and continues to assert quite a force on me. The other thing, though, about Becket is it's just a ripping yarn. I mean, it's a shocking story even now. I often, it's probably a bit childish, but say to my students, imagine if the Queen of England was implicated in the murder of Justin Welby. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen. I think it's unlikely, but it would shock and scandalize us now in, I think, much the same way that it did people in 1170. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing turn of events, and I think that's not to be underestimated.
I think that's right. I think because I think the Becket story is a heroic story about tyranny. It's about the danger of power, and it's about what it is that brings communities together, to heal and to repair. Those are very relevant themes for our times. We live in an age of division and difficulty, and power can get out of hand. And in a nutshell, that's what the Becket thing is a reminder of.
Yeah, I mean, another element of that, I suppose, is we're talking about a cult that is no longer about a church that's rebuilt around a shrine that was totally destroyed or mostly destroyed in 1538. And it's really fascinating to see the kind of chunks that we think are part of Becket's shrine on display in the show. And I think there too, the reason why was it at the top of Henry VIII's list at the time of Reformation to destroy it? And I think it's back to your point, Paul, that it is about power and about the reassertion of royal power over ecclesiastical power at a kind of critical moment.
That's right. I think the thing is what we must remember in England, particularly, which gives Becket's cult of power, but also the bishops are very powerful. England has rather few, but very rich and very powerful dioceses. And the point has been made that in some parts of the country, the local bishop was just as much of a king as the king. England is a very powerfully centralized country. The crown is phenomenally powerful. In France, it's quite other than that. The king was always historically less powerful, and for that reason, very simple point. In England, the kings of England were never loved. In France, the kings were loved, and the great biographies of the kings are always written in France. It's a fundamental difference, and yet curiously, the monarchy survived in this country despite our efforts in the 17th century, and it collapsed in France. Go figure.
It's fascinating. I think that you have in a way answered the follow-up question there about why it's valuable to keep thinking about Becket, because one thing that we've noticed from the exhibition is how we end the exhibition really in the late 16th, early 17th century when Becket's cult's at its most fragile in a sense. But, we didn't need to take it up to the present day because so many people are themselves reading into the exhibition the contemporary resonances that are present. I've noticed people on Twitter who superimpose Boris Johnson's head and Dominic Cummings' head onto Henry II and Thomas Becket, people who make comparisons with contemporary cancel culture or what they perceive to be cancel culture and the manuscripts that have been defaced in the exhibition. So I think and even Alexei Navalny and Jamal Khashoggi, people see these people in the Becket Henry, whether or not it's right or not. I mean, I don't know if you had something to say about that.
I would say, Lloyd, that there's nothing new about this. When Henry II is visualized in these pictures, he's made out to be like King Herod. It's the persecution of the innocents, the adoption of a type. The pasting on of the head onto is standard practice in the treatment of power, that we carry over, the idea of one king to another, or one leader to another. So there's absolutely nothing new about this.
But, well, there was one fascinating thing, I think, that Lloyd, you mentioned to me, and that I think wound up in the newspapers, which is the way the cult seems to have been, in a sense, reactivated by the objects, and especially, I think, the reliquary objects on display, with, what you might at first think are like people bashing their heads accidentally into the case, but turn out to be kiss marks, where people have been going around your show, and interacting with the cases. I'm sure you're not trying to encourage this. But I mean, in a way, kind of, Paul mentions the Black Prince at Canterbury. There's never not a rose or two that has been thrown onto his chest. And it's interesting the way that history is reactivated all the time and reimagined. And actually the objects that I was talking about and Paul were talking about continuously redo this, over and over, recast the story in the terms that made sense at the time that the objects were made.
And it's also the need, isn't it, that people have to perform and to make things part of a bigger symbolic order, which is a pressing lack, I think, in a way, in our perception of ourselves. Museums are often thought of as places where objects are set aside and set aside, but I think you're quite right. The power of these things often goes beyond that, and can be quite dangerous, as Henry VIII knew.
Well, we have apparently been having reports from British Museum members of miracles associated with Thomas Becket taking place after having visited the exhibition. But I think that's a discussion for another day. I wanted to get in one more broad question, really, which is to do with survival of objects. And I was actually in Exeter this weekend, and as you walk through the west front of Exeter and you look up, the very first thing you see is a boss of Becket's Martyrdom next to a canon saying ora pro me, ora pro nobis sancte tuo me, or something like that. And it reminds you that Becket was absolutely everywhere in the Middle Ages, and yet I'm thinking a little bit about how our perception of Becket has been distorted by the Reformation, by the loss of material. I mean, for instance, why has so much glass survived at Canterbury? I wonder if I could just put that question across to you both.
Well, what we have now is a situation where if you travel in Scandinavia, as I have done, following Becket's panel paintings, and you can travel to many parts of Europe and find much more Thomas Becket abroad than you can in this country. And it's an extraordinary testimony to the power of government. The destruction of Becket's image was a truly staggering testimony to what the state in a very centralized kingdom like England could do, which is the history, of course, of the English Reformation. And of course it's distorted. There's a huge amount we don't know about the cult. I mean, Alixe, you must reflect on this all the time.
Yeah, well, why? It's fascinating that so much of Canterbury is a kind of account of absence, the missing shrine with a candle. And I think that, on some level, what survives in England, it either survives because people have forgotten about it because they hid it away, or because it survives because it was kind of like too laborious to destroy it. And I think that actually accounts for some of the survival of the glass. You break all the glass, you have to make new windows, which is hugely expensive. And also it's like a real workout to destroy a huge glazed program like that. And so we're lucky, I think. But one of the fascinating kind of narratives woven through the exhibition is of objects that have been very, very lightly defaced, so that people, comply with the letter of the law by drawing a line through Becket's name or striking out an image, but doing so imperceptibly that you have to really look carefully, so that you could say, yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing that we in an era when public order is under much discussion, if you study illuminated manuscripts, which Alixe does and which I have done, and you turn to calendars and you look for the Feast of Becket, and you can always tell when a book was in England in the 16th century, because Becket's name, without exception, is erased. And the English were and probably are a nation that had no heresy and were phenomenally obedient to what the state wanted. And I think all the way through we get this constant message about how government is so powerful, and how obedient the English were in following it. And yet there we are. You go to the Trinity Chapel, and I think what, over half the stained glass windows about Becket survive. Extraordinary. And they, as Alixe says, they may very well have just been bone idle and couldn't be bothered to knock them out, and didn't want to replace them with clear glass. We don't know.
But we're lucky anyway. We're really phenomenally lucky that so much survives, and that you and your colleague Naomi Speakman have drawn so much of it together, just so brilliantly. And I can't imagine how challenging it was to do at a time of pandemic. So I mean, if the Becket cult carries on, Lloyd, I think it's down to you and Naomi.
Well,
I don't know that was your aim.
Yeah. Well. We got there in the end, I think. But we've run slightly over already. But I did want to just ask one more question before we draw tonight's event to a close, and it's returning to something that you were discussing, Paul, when you were talking about the materials. I mean, we're staying here at Trinity Chapel just for a moment. The materials that are associated with the shrine area, the pinky white of the stone, and so on. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the layers of meaning at Canterbury, because this has come up a few times in questions in the exhibition to me, about who would understand or need to understand the layers of meaning.
Yeah.
I was discussing the fragment, the colours, and Christ's tomb with a friend who was asking me about that, and also asking me about the glass and the complexity of the glass, the fact that the glass is very textual, there's so much text in it, and how that related, one, I guess, to a monastic audience, but also to a kind of a pilgrimage public audience who are coming to see.
Well, I think Lloyd, that final point is the key one, that you talk about layers of meaning and layers of materials, but you have layers of audience. You have a very high-powered, quite clever commissioning class of monks, clerics, people who are traveling to Paris, people who are traveling to Rome, very international, very well informed. If you read the great Abbot Suger of Saint Denis talking about the lovely Roman columns that he's seen in Rome, and he wants them for his church in Paris, it's exactly the same mindset. There's that level of audience, which is going to be also very alert to the symbolism. I mean, the religious illusion implicit in the colours in the materials and so on. There's going to be that kind of audience, and then there's going to be a sort of different kind of audience, which is rather as I was as a small boy of 9 years old when I went to Canterbury, and I was struck by the grandeur and the haunted character of the building, but the grandeur of it, and the organ started playing. I remember this, and this amazing sense of music and atmosphere, and mood counts for a great deal to what one might call what Becket would have called the vulgus, the ordinary people. The ordinary people are profound. Oh, this has always interested me, how these buildings move us. And it's a mysterious process, but I think in that sense there are several layers. You don't have to be educated. We know perfectly well, Chaucer talks about this in the Tale of Berin, that the poor peasants turned up, and half of them didn't have a clue how to read the stained glass windows. There were people who knew exactly what to do and ran up to the shrine and did their devotions, and other people stood around trying to figure out what on earth they were meant to do, what the windows meant, and were completely stumped, just as any modern tourist is if they haven't done their homework. So there's nothing new under the sun. You can't speak of an audience. You have to speak of a commissioning class and all sorts of audiences.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah, I think I mean, Canterbury was one of the European great centres of learning in Europe, and I don't think the monks sat around having meetings about public engagement and how can we make this comprehensible to the ordinary person. I think that on their list of priorities, I think that was zero. I think what they wanted to do was satisfy their own ambitions and sense of propriety and interest in the multiple meanings of things. I also think they were running a very lucrative tourist attraction, and they knew it. And when it started to dip, they thought of ways of reinvigorating it. Translating Becket into the new shrine space. Having the Black Prince entombed there against his, express instructions that he'd be in the crypt. I think that was a great way of kind of giving it a boost at a moment of low. I loved the graph that you showed, Paul, showing the kind of wavering fortunes. And I think one of the ways that they manage it is by, they probably had kind of versions of me and Paul and you, Lloyd, standing around and in the high season explaining the glass to the people who were waiting to kneel. So, because the inscriptions in the glass are in rather fragmentary Latin, they're, I think, hexameter verse. I mean, they're really not trying to connect with the everyday person. They're trying, I think, to excite their emotions and their interests, but they require the kind of explication of a kind of expert class, if you like.
Mm.
All good things must come to an end. And it leads me to thank you both for such wonderful introduction and discussion of Becket's cult. It really has been wonderful. So many thanks to you, Paul, and to you, Alixe. Talking also of lucrative tourist attractions, please do come to the British Museum. Please do book tickets to see the Becket exhibition and the Nero exhibition, or to visit the permanent collection. And if you feel inclined, also perhaps to donate. I think there was a link or a website link somewhere in this video. We also have our next upcoming event in connection with the exhibition is going to take place on the 15th of July, and it's going to be about Becket, Church and State, and that's going to be a discussion between Rowan Williams, the previous Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Bishop of Dover, Rose Hudson Wilkins. So please mark your calendars for that. Right, so thank you very much for joining us tonight, and hope to see you again soon, either at the museum in person or on one of our events online. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.